go. Well, it's really good to be here. I was just asked how long it's been since I stood in this room. It's been 10 years. I kind of can't believe it. So probably just as long since I've been on campus. It's a little bit surreal, but very good to be back. So what I'm hoping to do in this sort of crazy talk I tried to put together is give you an overview of what I did on my my field study experiences. What I did how that led to choice for graduate studies, what I did on the internships and experiences during my graduate work, and then how that sort of evolved into career work experience. And my sort of trying to figure out what my audience would be and what would be the most valuable things to tell. And I thought, one of the overriding tacks I might take is to try to tell you what I thought things would be like, what they were actually like, and then the lessons I learned from all of that. So I'll just kind of launch into it. Okay, so the first field study I went on was to Cape Town, South Africa. That was in, 95, I think. And it was a really exciting time to go. I was a zoology major. I started BYU 92 and was really, had done a lot of biology in high school and was my big area of interest. And I had a really fantastic experience in the zoology department, and I had amazing professors that gave me fantastic work experience there as well. I went to Monterey and did work at the marine station there. I worked for Dennis Shiozawa, going down the Colorado and the Green Rivers for weeks at a time in the summertime, collecting samples. It was fantastic, but I started to get a little claustrophobic at BYU, and I really got very curious and wanted to see sort of the wider world. But I wanted to do it in a way that would not just be taking off and traveling. I felt like I really wanted to have it be an enriching part of my academic experience. So somehow, I don't even remember how, but I heard through the grapevine that there was this office that somehow I could go out of the country but still try to get academic, credit. And it was really new at the time. I don't think that many people had gone. And South Africa had always been a place that was really fascinating. At that point in time, it was a really, really critical and exciting juncture in its history, and I so wanted to go at that point in time because that was just right when the government changed over, when apartheid had ended, and the government had held a referendum for the entire population to determine whether apartheid would be over, whether they would have free elections for the whole population, and they did. And the whole world thought that South Africa would crater and would erupt into like civil war and bloodbath. And there was a certain amount of there was a lot of violence during the transition time between the vote to hold free elections and the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, where he had been for, I think, 30 years. And his election as president, but a lot of that was South African military and police in the townships. It wasn't the black and colored population going out and doing what everyone sort of thought they would do. So when I got there, it was just Mandela had just been elected and been in office not that long. And so it was this incredible time to be there and to there was this huge sense of hope about what would happen with this country and what it would be like, and what are the opportunities now for this population that's lived under this horrible oppression for so many years, and how was the country gonna resurrect itself? Because though Nelson Mandela was now president, though a lot of mindset has changed, all the laws were still in place that were enforcing apartheid, and you actually had to legislate the change. So for every white child in school was allotted, let's say 5 rand a child, versus every black child was allotted 2 cents. And that budget, though, the government had changed, that budget carried forward for the next year and the next year and the next year. There's so many laws that had to be changed and so many things that had to be done to start changing the country. So anyway, what I did when I was there, I was really interested in health and nutrition issues. So I worked in a women's nutrition center, working with women who had been referred there with their children because their children were at risk nutritionally in some way. So a lot of these women were single moms. A lot of them some had twins, which was just an extra burden. A lot of their children had severe anemia or kwashiorkor or polio, like a lot of things where they really needed attention with nutrition. So the center that I worked in worked with mothers on, trying to sort of address, like, okay, here are the available foods that you don't have a huge amount of choices, but here are the things that you really need to work on, try to procure and, get and feed to your kid and watch them eat, and like really working with them to make sure their kids were, developing and also trying to hook them up with jobs and income so that we could sort of address a lot of these ancillary issues. It wasn't that they were just sitting idly by, happy that their kids were malnourished. They really didn't have any money. They had no resources. They often, didn't have any partners to help them out. So it was a really great experience. These are just a few pictures. I apologize. I wish I had more pictures of the actual nutrition center and some of the people I worked with, but I've been moving like all over the world in the past several years. So I felt lucky that I could even find the ones that I did find. It just gives you a little picture of just what the townships were like. As this is right outside where I worked. That's next. I feel like that experience was really life-changing. I had only been to Canada, I think, before that. And being in a place that was so different and that had such extreme poverty it really rocked my world. It was so incredible to be there, but psychologically really difficult, I think, to take in the huge amount of poverty that I was seeing and the amount of disadvantage. And we had a really interesting living situation that first time we were there. The university and everybody was a little freaked out that they were sending all these students to post-apartheid South Africa and working in some of the most violent townships in Cape Town. So, record numbers of murders and, stuff going on. And so they really tried to protect us and make sure we were set up in ways that we could be as safe as possible. So I lived with a white family in an incredibly wealthy suburb of Cape Town when I was there. And every day, it was sort of like living in Beverly Hills. Like, it was the most, gorgeous, pristine. The only people of color that were there were maids and bus drivers, and they even had a hard time getting there to actually, work there. So, and at first I was like, this is not what I wanted. I really wanted to be living in a township. This isn't the experience I was hoping for. But actually it was incredible because I got to see this huge panorama of what South Africa's like. Every day I would go home to this incredibly wealthy suburb, and then every morning I would get on a bus, and it would take me like hours to get out to the townships. And it was sort of showing me, it was like the reverse trip. It was sort of like, well, what's it like to be a menial laborer in the townships trying to get to work every day? It takes that long for all of those people to do it. And they set the city up in that way to make it difficult. They didn't want, it to be easy for people to get to work. They didn't want it to be easy for people to mix together. And I'm sure you all know about apartheid and how basically they, segmented the country where you could live if you owned property as a black person or a colored person. You often had that property taken away. There were designated areas where people could live, separate bathrooms, kind of like the South and Jim Crow laws even, but so much worse. I'm sure you all are familiar with that. But anyway, it was really incredible. It really changed my life. It was one of the, sort of the first experience that I really felt like I had seen a picture of something much bigger than anything I'd ever experienced before. I went with a bunch of students. We all did different things. I was really interested in health and nutrition, and so was another woman who was on the field study. There were other people interested in education, other people interested in business. There was a group of maybe, I don't know, I think there were probably 10 of us. There were a lot of us. And it was an amazing time. It was fantastic. So I came back and had, such a positive experience that I really wanted to go back. And so a couple years later, I went back as a facilitator, and it was equally incredible, but in very different ways. So this time, we had, a couple years had gone by, we'd made more connections. That was the first trip BYU had done to South Africa, and now made more connections, and we felt like we could actually place students living in certain townships because we felt like we knew, where was safe, and, we had really good connections of, like which, areas we felt like were giving a really good cultural experience, but not putting students in any kind of, danger more than you would be like living in Manhattan or something like, just like the same city smarts you would use over there, same, something like that. So second time I got to live in a colored township with a colored family, which was just a completely different experience than living in this like Beverly Hills white area the first time. And it was fantastic. I got a whole nother perspective because I had a lot of experience with the black population in South Africa, but not so much with the colored population. They're kind of they live in a bit of in a liminal state in South Africa, because when apartheid really became legislated, you had to be designated as one of like 5 different categories. And often the colored population was very, very painful and very difficult because colored in South Africa represents a mix of different races and different heritage and different lineage. And instead of taking pride in that, it was a marker of stigma for them. And also very difficult because a lot of people before apartheid identified as being white and might look completely white, as far as that stereotype goes. But when they had to register, it was found out that they had a black relative at some point in time, and then they were registered as colored and like lost all their friends, all their connections, their property, had to move into a colored area. It was crazy. And that population really carried that stigma. It had the highest rate of suicide, unemployment, mental health issues, because a lot of people were actually very educated and had a lot of opportunities, but really had a sort of a cultural identity crisis. And the women I worked with in the township before were all black, and I continued to work in more black townships the second time I was there, but living in this colored area was a really rich experience. It was, they're very into music, and I felt like every morning at like 6 a.m. you'd sort of like, wake up, what am I hearing? And it would be like, there was a very large Muslim population or Muslim contingent among the colored population. So you'd hear the call to prayer. Every grandmother, anybody from the age of, 2 to 95 would turn on like, hip hop music at like 6 a.m. That was just like how everybody started their day. It was really sort of, exciting and wonderful. So being a facilitator, that was also really fantastic experience. I felt like being in charge of other students and trying to hook them up with different organizations to work with and fulfill their credit requirements was just a really good experience. I got to do my own research, but I also got to, it felt more sort of like work experience, professional experience, like managing and mentoring, and I definitely use that, later on in my, getting into grad school. So I'll talk about it in a little bit. I'm gonna move on. I'm like gabbing too much. Okay, so fast forward a couple years, I came back to BYU and then started working for the field studies office, and I was really interested in India. Had always wanted to go there. A big group of students one semester was really interested, and they had not been able to find anyone who'd had facilitator experience and been to India. So I co-facilitated myself and the woman in the background. We took a group of, I think, like 9 students to India. Many of you probably have already been or you've heard about it. There's a village in the southern part of India called Chavati, where there's been a long-term connection and place for BYU students to go and have a really integrated village experience. So that was pretty awesome. It was fascinating to see how all these different students adjusted to life in an Indian village, and it was very challenging and very mind-blowing, I think, for a lot of them, and everyone did so well. Like, you know, it was, I feel like this picture's sort of funny. We prep students beforehand that a lot of, when you go on a field study, a lot of it's just being there and trying to be a part of village life. And it's really difficult, I think, for a lot of students to sort of like tamp down the like, what am I doing? I need to always be busy. I need to be, you know, doing this or this or that. I feel, and village life in India is so slow. I mean, there's just the pace of the day. It feels like after the day is over, you feel like you've lived 10 days. You know, it just like goes on and on and on. So we did a lot of this, hanging on the veranda, playing card games in our spare time and trying to like talk to the kids and witness their games and see what they were doing. And it was fantastic. I worked for an NGO that did a lot of development work, and I did interviews. I was really interested in migration and issues involving work and migration and women. So my project involved doing in-depth interviews with many, many women whose basically there's a big phenomenon in India where there's just not enough work. There's tons of people and not enough work, and men often go like to the Gulf or they go to the city to work, and the women always stay in the village. They really never go with the husband. So it creates these situations where men and women who are married, who have kids, might see each other once a year, or maybe not, might see each other once every several years, and men send the money home, but they stay married forever. And I was really curious about what those relationships were like, how it was influenced by arranged marriages versus what a lot of, it's more commonly called love marriages, people who reject the idea of arranged marriages and choose their spouse for themselves, but that often engenders a lot of animosity from their families, and how they dealt with that when the spouses were living in like two totally different parts of the world. So that was really interesting for me. Just go through some pictures really quick. These are just some pictures of the people we lived with in the village, and this man is now passed, but he was a big part of life there for a long, long time. This is a wedding we were at. One student, Indian weddings last for like the whole day, and you're crammed in like sardines, and you can never get out. This was like hour 10, I think, at the wedding. We were just sort of getting goofy, taking pictures. These are all the kids that live in Chavati. That little girl, I think she's now, gosh, 12. I mean, she's grown up now, the very one on the bottom. And I'm really curious about all these kids because they're now men working and doing goodness knows what. I'm so curious. I'd love to see if there was ever a project of doing more long-term, in-depth sort of anthropological interviews of these kids and see where they're at 10 years later, because this program has been going on so long now. They're probably married and have kids of their own. The other thing that we did on this field study, which was really incredible, we spent several months in Chavati, and then I took the students and guided an international world religions course, sorry. So we visited like all of the major religious sites, almost, I mean, not all, there's so many, but there's so many, you know, religions in India. There's Buddhism, there's Sufism, there's Islam, there's Hinduism and Jainism, it's like everything you can kind of imagine, Christianity, everything. So we worked our way up through India. In a Tibetan sort of refugee area. This is a Buddhist monk that sort of caught my eye, but we visited sites, you know, famous sites of Islam. This is a very famous Jain site. Lots of Hindu temples. This is just a picture of the fields in Chavati. This is sort of what it looks like, the kind of typical farmland in India. There's another Jain site. Those are all the pictures of the students. We're just eating, hanging out, looking grubby, as we sort of did. I was like, as a facilitator, I felt like my big challenge was to make us look presentable. I felt like living in a village in India, every single woman there was so much cleaner than any of us, showered less, looked more wonderful than all of us put together, and I was always really amazed by that. And they're always sort of commenting on our appearance, and we always tried to, like, you know, really integrate ourselves and respect the local customs and, you know, what people wanted us to wear. But the women were always sort of looking at us like, gosh, you know, how come you guys, like, can't look a little bit nicer, you know, when you're out? But we did all wear traditional dress. We were just didn't look as good as everyone there. We went to Bodh Gaya, which is where the Buddha sat under the tree and fasted, and like that whole thing happened. That was like really cool to see that tree and, you know, visit that site. There's another Hindu temple. This is Hyderabad. I think this is, I can't remember what temple that is, but anyway, another one. We became friends with and took along a Buddhist monk on our travels for a little while. It was a really eye-opening experience of what Buddhist monks are like and sort of what that experience can be. It was really fascinating. He was a super nice kid. It's a Christian church that we visited. I only put this photo in here as sort of like a funny illustration of it's sort of like the end of my, that concludes, you know, what I did for field studies. And I sort of love this picture because, you know, I was trying to help when I was a facilitator in South Africa and India. I was always trying to help students with culture shock, like trying to help them deal with all the differences they were facing, and the food, the weather, the people, you know, just the environment of being like completely out of their element. And, you know, everyone should expect that to happen to them. Like, and everyone deals with it in different ways. You know, I remember my facilitator, when I first went to South Africa, he was like crazy and ironing his clothes every morning. I was sort of like, you're kidding me. Like, that was like, but it was his way of sort of like dealing with all the chaos, was like wearing these like perfectly starched and ironed clothes every single day. I was like, all right, like, well, that must be his way, you know. At the time, I didn't really get it. But anyway, I laugh at this picture because this is the end. This is the very end of when we did this world religion course, and then we ended up in the hill country in India, where the students studied Hindi. And I had been doing all these interviews, and I just used that time to transcribe. So I spent hours and hours and hours like transcribing interviews. And I had really I felt so well with like culture shock, you know, and guiding students through that process, and like, you know, talking people down from being like, you know, a couple times some students just get so overwhelmed. They're like, I don't know, maybe I want to go home. And I'll be like, it's cool. We're going to go to lunch. We're going to talk. We're going to like get through it. And they always did. And, you know, everyone always ended up staying. But it was a huge, you know, shift for a lot of people. But I love this picture because I totally finally hit culture shock when I got up to the north of India. It was crazy. I got this terrible eye infection. It was this random thing that happens when you're like up in the hills and it's dry, and, you know, you get an infected eye. So these like horribly infected eyes. I had something stolen, like I had a deposit for our guest house, and it was like sort of mixed up. And I eventually figured it out. It took like a billion hours of like contacting government officials and like going through all these channels. And I finally like, you know, got it done and was like really proud of myself. But I totally hit a wall. Like we had one T-shirt left at that point that we were all circulating between us, you know, like a Western T-shirt. And I wore that like every day. I was like, no more traditional dress. Like, I'm wearing the T-shirt. I like read a bunch of Jane Austen novels for like 2 weeks. I had totally checked out. But everyone was really cool about it. And I like got my game back and, you know, ended up with a great end of my experience. But I just sort of put that in there to sort of show that, I don't know, it's a big adjustment for a lot of people, and everyone deals with it in different ways. And even the facilitators sometimes, you know, have their moments of like, it's like a little too crazy. So then I went to, Then I went to grad school. Oh my God, I gotta get through these. So those experiences were, I guess what I'm really want to put out there is those experiences were key to me getting into graduate school. I got into Yale School of Public Health, Tulane's MPH program, and University of North Carolina. I got into every school I applied to, though my GPA was not stellar. It was all about my internship experience. The essays I wrote in my interviews, everyone wanted to know, like, how did you get to have this experience as an undergrad? Because I had my research, I had the papers that I had written up and the conference presentations I had done from that research, and they were really blown away. They were like, okay, so your GPA is this, and your what's the test you take for grad school? I'm like GMAT, right? GRE, yeah. Your GRE is like, but your experience is like out of control. Like no one could really believe it, and they were really surprised it came from BYU. I think it intrigued everyone because though BYU has a reputation for being Mormon school and doing missionary work, this was like completely secular, non-missionary type international experience, and it was really new. So I was pretty surprised and thrilled and excited to go. So anyway, I went, and it was really fantastic experience. I feel like I'm going to talk about that slightly later. I decided to go into make my focus international health. The public health program there has a lot of different focuses, but that was what I was really interested in. I was really interested in breastfeeding and food, and so I went to East Timor to do my thesis on breastfeeding practices and household food security. So I'm going to give you the super quick rundown about East Timor. The reason I chose that was because at that point in time, right when I started Yale, okay, here's Asia, here's East Timor, down there. I had almost, when I got there, I don't think I'd ever heard of East Timor, actually. It was just sort of becoming a big news issue. And then here's a bigger close-up. But East Timor it's a small island. It has a population of about 1 million people. Quick history is it has been a colony. It was a colony of Portugal, and then declared its independence from Portugal in the 70s, and it was immediately invaded by Indonesia, which then spent about 2 decades sort of decimating the local population. It's estimated that between 250,000 and 500,000 people were killed, and there's a bit of controversy about whether that was genocide or not, but I would say the overwhelming opinion at this point is that it was a systematic government effort to decimate the local population and make it Indonesian. So when I got there, the situation had gotten so dire, it had gotten to the point of having UN attention. There had been a vote to among the population to make East Timor independent, and that was supported by the UN. It was a UN monitored vote, but sadly, in between the vote and when the Indonesian army pulled out, they razed the country. They burned and pillaged everything, killing many people and really destroying like almost the entire infrastructure of the country. So when I started grad school, that had just happened, and it was a huge public health issue. And Yale is sort of connected to everyone and everything. So I was approached by one of the professors saying, we'd like to bring a team of students over to help do some assessments, sort of the public health situation. And I sort of grabbed onto that as an idea for my thesis. I had actually tried to go back to India and South Africa for my thesis, and none of those, for one reason or another, worked out. I was really sort of despondent about it, but this came up and I just sort of went for it, and it ended up being a really great experience. Mostly you have to do like an internship experience during your grad program there, and just the organizations that I had contacted to do internships were being really flaky and just couldn't get it together to like say I could come or whatever. It happened to a lot of students actually when I was in grad school. So anyway, it's a very Christian country. This is just a picture of what was going on during the military pullout. There's a huge refugee problem because the Indonesian army forced so many people out of their homes, and they started to flee that they had enormous amounts of refugee camps and all the public health problems that go with that. Eventually, the Untitled, or the UN, composed of the Australian military and military from all over the world, came in and restored peace and set up a presence in the country, which had just happened like the month before I went. But it was a very sad time. There was a huge amount of death and sadness. What had been going on. A lot of people, every family was affected. Every family I knew had lost someone. So I put these slides in because my plan when I went to do this, my thesis research was, I had planned it out really well. I had a very succinct survey about breastfeeding and household food security that was 7 questions long. It was statistically going to be really easy to analyze these questions, turn it into a really clean thesis. I was super excited. I had found a clinic, and the doctor who ran it said that he would let me interview patients in the capital. And the patients, I had a really great, sort of clean population I could do. It was in this certain area. It was going to be super, I thought, I can get this done in a 4-week trip during, Christmas break. This was my plan. And then, when I got there, it totally fell apart. I arrived, and the doctor who worked at the clinic was like, actually, no, you can't do that. I'm not going to let you do your survey. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, actually, what we really need is someone to go up into the mountains and figure out what those people need up there. I was like, what mountains are those? How do I get there? Can I have a car? Do I need a UN bodyguard? What's going on? And he was like, you figure it out. And I was like, oh my gosh, it really threw me for a loop. But I have to say, this is where my internship or my field study experience at BYU came in so handy, because I was like, well, I guess I've done that before, flown to a country, really had sort of a loose plan, but really you had to figure it out. You had to say okay, I'm here now. I've got a research plan, but all these unexpected things sometimes happen, and you just have to make it work. So I had crazy amounts of emergency calls with my thesis advisor. We had to put together a whole new survey over the phone, with her being in the library and me being there and trying to borrow computer time. And then we had to pass that all through human subjects review, because you can't actually, ask anyone a question that you're going to use for any kind of medical research without a human subjects review board. And it was Christmas time, so the board was not meeting. But people were great. They all came together, approved my survey, and I actually got a thesis out of it, which was sort of a miracle. But I had to hire some interpreters to come with me. So these women came with me and helped me interview women all over, hiking through the mountains, trying to find people who still even had homes that hadn't been destroyed, and ask them questions about what they were eating and how I was allowed to put in a couple breastfeeding questions, which I was really glad about, because that was still a big nutritional interest of mine. But yeah, it was pretty fascinating. There were no stores, there were no food. Ate a lot of coconuts and just random stuff. So it was a really fantastic experience. I learned how to do survey work not in the classical way. Picking a hut, a point in time in the middle of nowhere, and then coming up with a method to go every other hut. Okay, we'll hike for 30 minutes. The first person who sees one, that will be one. The next time we see a hut, that will be the other one. That's how we'll do our statistical sample. But it worked. These were my UN bodyguards. They were great. We went to the UN, told them where we were going. They said we couldn't go without UN bodyguards, so we did. The guy here actually is now the president of East Timor, so I spent a whole bunch of time with him, not knowing he would become president. That was pretty cool. This is the family I lived with. This is the house they lived in. This is just sort of, a traditional ceremony. I want to give an idea of, yeah, there he is again. So I guess, yeah, there's so much to say. I want you guys to have time to ask questions. But one of the things I felt like what would I tell people now in my situation then? What would I want you to know if you were going into public, or thinking about a career in public health, or even thinking about grad school? One of the things that happened with my thesis is the organization that helped me go was a Health and Human Rights Organization, there was a big controversy over what would happen with my data. I felt like once I got there, the organization that actually really helped me get up to the mountains and find the villages I needed to find was in charge. They were the public health provider for the way the UN did it. They divided the country up into different segments, and different NGOs were in charge of the public health needs of that area. So I had to contact this NGO, and they were really key in getting me up there. But one of their conditions was you cannot leave the country without giving us this data, because that's what everybody does. They come here, they do research, they take the data away, and then here we are, we have nothing left. So I, made a call to the people that had, sort of hooked me up at Yale for this. They had their own Health and Human Rights Organization and their own publishing interests. And I said, I'm here and I'm not coming back unless you say I can give them the data. And that was a big, big problem. They forbid me to do it. We had a huge amount of negotiations. There was even sort of threats of will I be sued or not? But I said, I'm not leaving the country if I can't give them the data. And eventually they relented. I got to give them data, which of course they only did what they needed to do, which was use it for providing public health. But Yale was a very, scholarly place and really interested in ownership of publications, was really upset by that. But it ended up working out, which I was, really glad about, because that could have been bad. Anyway, the other thing I would say is, it's really good to be flexible, to be able to change your focus and your plans as necessary. I had a fantastic advisor who, spent her entire Christmas break over the phone on a crackly line trying to help me come up with a completely new, plan so that I hadn't just, gone over there and not really been able to do anything. The other thing I would say about, thesis work and grad school is it's so important to finish. When I graduated from Yale, which I'd think, gosh, it's full of overachievers, everyone's going to finish. Half my class hadn't finished their thesis projects by graduation deadline. And there were lots of jobs, but also lots of people interested in them. The only reason that I got the job that I got, which I'll talk about in a minute, is because my thesis was done, and all the other applicants were pages away, or maybe a month away, or maybe a week away, hadn't finished by the deadline. But I did, and I think it showed a lot of people that, I could come up with a project and finish it and do it without, a certain amount of whatever trust was involved there. So that was really good. The only other thing I'll say about grad school is, where is my slide? I think it's going to take a while. Okay, only other thing I would say is I was really lured by the prospect of going to an Ivy League, and in the end, I'm not sure about whether that was worth it or not. I got amazing amount of connections there, amazing amount of career connections, but it was amazingly expensive. And when you're going into public health, unless you're going to go into pharmaceutical research, you're not going to make that money back. So I'm glad I went there. I feel like it was really good in a lot of ways, and I ended up having to have 3 jobs, being a TA for medical anthropology, getting out, a lot of different options to make my loan burden manageable after graduation. I was really glad that it was manageable, but for a lot of people, it wasn't. So if you're thinking about public health, you should really think about what you want to do after and really research the kind of salary you are actually going to make before you make that big investment. I'm glad I made it. It worked out for me, but for other people, it didn't. So I just want to put that out there. The other thing I wanted to say is there were lots of different programs at Yale, and the International Health Program, though it was good, when I started, it actually ended up being good, but it was a little shaky. I really had to work hard to get the classes and experience that I wanted to get, even by taking classes in the nursing school and taking classes in the medical school, because that program, just at the time I had joined it, had lost several professors and was sort of weak. And it was really hard to think about having paid that much money for a program that was not as good as I thought it was. But if I had talked to more students in the program before I had decided to go, I would have gotten that information. So I'd say it's super important to talk to students in the program the year you're applying to figure out if it's really the right one for you. Okay. Gonna be quick. Okay, so when I graduated, I got really lucky. 2 projects came up the month I graduated, both looking for project managers, one in India and one in South Africa. I only got those jobs because I had research experience in India and South Africa. All the other candidates were exactly as qualified as I was, but I was the only one who had those field study experiences. And they were like, well, you're hired. It's great. So for me, I feel like my experience at BYU was totally integral to me getting these 2 jobs. The first project I started working on was HIV-related stigma in India, mostly looking at hospitals and how the hospitals treat HIV/AIDS patients and how they deal with universal precautions and how they do that. The second one was a project involving the pasteurization of breast milk in South Africa. I'll run through these real quick. So, map of South Africa, there's Cape Town, everyone knows where everything is there. I was working up here, which I hadn't had any experience in that part of the country, but it was still good. So, super quick, the pasteurization of breast milk project was supposed to be, this is what the project was supposed to be. When I started and I got hired, this is what I thought I would be doing is someone had developed a really awesome technology of helping HIV-positive women hand express breast milk and use this super low-tech method to pasteurize it to inactivate or kill the HIV virus. They could still give the breast milk to their babies. It was really awesome because it used materials that everybody's got. Everyone's got a pot like that. You'd think they wouldn't, but they do. And access to electricity, either it's off the power line, like off the grid or what. Everyone can have a kettle, a metal pot, and a peanut butter jar. They had found this specific peanut butter jar that was nationally produced that had just the right amount of glass thickness and, heat resistance to pasteurize the breast milk but not kill all the nutrients in it. So it allowed women to actually feed their breast milk to their babies and reduce the risk of HIV transmission. Actually eliminated due to breast milk consumption. The reason that it was developed is that there's a condition called necrotizing enterocolitis, and it basically is the death of intestinal issues, and it affects premature infants or really sick newborns. And it is really complicated there because if you're HIV positive, really the best thing to do for your baby to eliminate any risk of HIV transmission is to formula feed, but that's really expensive and also very controversial in South Africa. And if it carries a higher risk of this condition, it's really irritating to the infant's intestines, and it can make them develop this condition which is irreversible, and the babies die. So it was a really important thing, to do. So this is what I thought I was going to be working on, and sort of trying to come up with my perspective at that point. I'd been, I'd seen a lot of the world. I had been at BYU, though, for a very long time. I was still Mormon, had a lot of, sort of, I don't want to say prejudgments, but a certain amount of a mindset about the moral issues around HIV and AIDS, which I felt like I had really, gotten a good handle on and expanded my mind around during my grad school experience, but I wouldn't say it was the thing that I wanted to work on. It was slightly uncomfortable for me from someone from my background and perspective. But this study ended up not being okay. We figured that eventually it wasn't actually morally justifiable to do this research. We found out that this method does work. There really didn't need any more research needed, and it felt unethical to put money into doing research that really wasn't making a difference to anyone. The thing that really was making a difference is that women were choosing to not breastfeed or to breastfeed as a result of how they felt about being HIV positive. So a lot of women, really the better choice for them would be to formula feed because it would eliminate the risk of HIV to the baby. But when you're formula feeding a baby in South Africa, that is a clear signal that you are HIV positive. And no one at that point in time in South Africa wanted to admit that. That was a really, really terrible stigma for so many people, and so sad because probably a quarter of the population was positive at that time. So this project turned into a project of addressing HIV-related stigma and how to help women address that in their own lives to be able to make a safe feeding choice. So it became the project to work with women to be able to say to their families, I'm HIV positive, and this is why I'm choosing to formula feed, or helping them understand the risks of exclusive breastfeeding, which is the second safest option, but that you have to keep breastfeeding. You can never go back and forth between formula and breast milk because it will make the infant's gut more permeable and more susceptible to HIV. So you've got to choose either exclusive breastfeeding or you've got to choose exclusive formula feeding. You can't go back and forth between the two. And it was really hard for a lot of women to say, like, here's my choice. And by doing this, like, if I'm going to formula feed, but I've got to come out to my family, and I've got to find a way to feel safe to do that. So it became this huge, bigger project of addressing the issue of HIV-related stigma, which meant talking about it and putting it out there in a very graphic, very clear way that I really had had no previous experience with. And it ended up being an incredible experience, but it really challenged a lot of my sort of moral underpinnings at the time and my sort of greater sense of, how to think about sexuality, how to think about public health issues. It was really great, but really, at first, a hard thing to kind of get my mind around. So anyway, I flip through these really fast. We ended up working with an NGO to do a billboard campaign that addressed the issue of HIV stigma, safe sex, and protection, like in a very graphic, very head-on way. So like a lot of these billboards or things that I worked on, we worked with something called Love Life, and it was a big campaign to put like safe sex and HIV out in the headlines and make it an issue that South Africa could not ignore, which was really important at the time because the president of South Africa was Thabo Mbeki, and he was claiming at that time that HIV did not cause AIDS. And his health minister was denying the use of antiretrovirals to pregnant women to prevent transmission to their babies, and using that HIV doesn't exist or HIV doesn't cause AIDS as the rationale behind that. So there was a huge amount of backlash and outcry about that, and really the NGO community took it into their own hands to say, like, that's not okay, you can't treat HIV like that in the country, it's killing people, we're going to address it head on without your approval, really. So we worked on these billboard campaigns, which, for me, coming from BYU, was like, oh my gosh, this is not what I thought I'd be doing with my public health career, but that's what it was about when I graduated. It was about HIV and addressing those issues. So these are some of the, projects that I worked on. And it ended up being a great campaign. I felt like it was really good. This are kind of going back to some of my coworkers I worked with, places I was. I'm going to skip the India study. I feel like I don't have any time, but basically that was also looking at HIV-related stigma in India and doing it through a hospital-based study and more of a from a psychological perspective. That's a map of India. I feel like I shouldn't even go through these. I want to save time for questions, which I'm going to do now. So, questions in the 5 minutes that we have left.
Does anybody have a question? Any questions?
So I'm just curious, did you go right into your MPH program after graduating, or did you?
I did. I was actually in India having my grad school interviews on a payphone.
Oh, really?
From the street, yeah.
So how long? I'm just curious, how long did you spend at BYU?
I was here 6 years.
6 years. Okay.
Yeah, I was here 6 years.
So you were taking classes as you were doing this research and being a facilitator and stuff?
Yeah, I was earning credit the whole time. doing research with Women's Research Institute, doing sort of having independent credit, anthropology credit, international development credit, kind of all of it.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I know that was fast. I really buzzed through the end of my presentation.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Can you comment a little bit on building, your thoughts on building research capacity? So I was intrigued by your comments about data ownership. Thanks.
Building research capacity among students, or? Yeah, I feel like that was one of the biggest challenges of my career, especially in my project in India, because it was a joint collaboration between Yale and a research institution in India. And the expectations about research and publication are just so different. What a Yale researcher wants to research and publish is so different than what the researchers in India wanted. And similarly, in my South Africa project, it wasn't so much about publishing in international journals and doing, double-blind clinical controlled studies. People wanted to do, in the countries where I worked, people wanted to do research that was fast, maybe wasn't as academically sound as a lot of American institutions wanted, and there was a huge amount of friction between the academics on both sides, and that was an enormous part of my job as a project manager, was trying to get people to come to the same page and agree to a publication schedule that was fair to everyone. And eventually I got out of research because I found it really exhausting to try to manage that, and I felt like what I really enjoy is the field work and interventions and analyzing progress, and all I was really doing was deciding who's going to be the first author, the second author, the third author, the fifth author, and then how do we tweak the paper title to get everyone another turn to be the author, the author, the author, the author. So I don't know what to say about that. I think it's a conundrum with all academic research. I'm not sure anyone's figured it out.
As an undergrad, how many, and from your 3 field study experiences, how many of those experiences did you get your research published?
I don't think I ever published. I did conferences here, and I wrote my research up for like the Women's Research Institute, but I could have. I just didn't. I wasn't interested. If I had been and I had been more motivated, I'm sure I could have gotten publications out of them, but I just wasn't. It would have been good for my academic career, especially if I was going to go into academia, which I really got disillusioned by and didn't end up wanting to do. But I think it'd be super important for people to try to do that if that was, more your long-term goal.
Any last questions? Okay, thanks.